Welcome to Living Outside the Matrix, the philosophy show where we explode the many modern myths of our culture and examine important issues that have a bearing on our lifestyle choices. Hi there, I'm Nigel Howitt, and on the show today we're going to be discussing the moral case for using fossil fuels. And with me to do this, it's a great pleasure to be joined by Don Watkins. Don is Director of Education at the Centre for Industrial Progress, where he works with industry and the public to promote the ideal of human flourishing through industrial progress. He's also authored a few books and co-authored several books, I should add. He wrote Roosevelt Care, How Social Security is Sabotaging the Land of Self-Reliance, and I believe he co-authored at least 3 books with Yaron Brook, who's also been on the show, I'm pleased to say. Don, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and a very warm welcome to the show.
Great, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Don, this is obviously a controversial issue, isn't it? Most people out there, even thinking people, are find it difficult to embrace the whole climate issue, fossil fuels. You know, fossil fuels have been described as the sort of favourite whipping boy at the moment in terms of the energy industries. Perhaps we could just explore the context before we sort of dive into the specifics of the moral case for using fossil fuels, and perhaps acknowledge there's sort of a trend for anti-industrialization. Would you say there's the anti-capitalist movement and now the environment movement being used as a means to sort of reduce the human impact? Would you think that's a fair assumption?
Yeah, I mean, look, human beings have this ongoing need in order to produce, that is, to transform nature in order to thrive, in order to flourish. And one of the most important ways that we transform nature is through our use of energy. Energy is what powers everything we do, and it allows us to have machines that do our work for us. And if your goal is human flourishing, then that's a really good thing. And you want to do as much energy as possible, and you want to transform nature in positive ways as much as necessary. And then, of course, we can always have negative impacts whenever we're transforming nature, and you want to minimize those. But there are people who don't actually value human flourishing. And, you know, historically, they would have, you had ideologies such as socialism, fascism, communism, in which people who didn't value the individual human life would kind of obliterate those in the name of grabbing power for themselves. And there's another strain that became particularly dominant in the 60s, or since the 60s, which just in communism, totalitarianism generally had a veneer of being pro-human, but it was pro the collective. It wasn't pro any given individual. They were all dispensable and were dispensed of it on quite a scale. But at least they said, well, some future individuals will be part of this glorious collectivist future. Whereas environmentalism as a philosophy was this philosophy that put nature above human beings. It didn't claim that the goal is some wonderful future for human beings. What it really did is it said that the ideal was a planet that had as minimal impact from human beings as possible. In fact, their sort of ideal that they would hold out is a planet that looked as if we had never existed. Absolutely. And that view gained increasing prominence, and to the point where even people who would not hold it anywhere like that explicitly, we accept very much this idea of, our goal should be to be as green as possible or to be as renewable as possible. And if you really think through what that means, it's a goal that pushes you away from transforming nature, away from industrialization, away from energy progress. And yet those are the things that we most need to flourish.
Absolutely. So it's an important part of the context then. We've got this environmental movement, which, I think Alex dubbed it as the anti-human movement. And it clearly is, from what you say. If the end goal is to minimize our impact on the planet, then if you extrapolate that up to its extreme, that means no humans, doing anything. It means no human action. So this is obviously quite absurd. And it's very, very widespread, the acceptance of this.
Well, let me pause on one point there, though. It's obviously absurd when it's stated that way, but it's very rarely stated that way. So the plausible cover and the reason why the environmental movement was able to get off the ground, because if you just told people, hey, I hate human beings and don't want them around, you're not going to get very far with that. But one of the side effects of us transforming nature, as I kind of indicated earlier, is like we can have negative impacts. We can create pollution. Now, that is not a good thing, all else being equal. Now, and so when people looked around, they said, yeah, there's real problems with pollution that we want to minimize. And so what the environmental movement did is it said, it combined this view of our goal should be to minimize our impact with the goal of minimizing pollution. But those are not the same goal. An environment that is good for human beings requires transforming nature on a very significant scale. Nature doesn't give us clean water. It doesn't give us clean air. It doesn't give us a safe climate. All of these things require transformation. And so what happened was people bought into this plausible idea of, yeah, we need to be concerned with pollution, but it was conceptualized as we need to be concerned with pollution by minimizing our impact on nature rather than impacting nature in positive ways and minimizing negative impacts, which is the way to think about it from a human flourishing perspective.
Excellent. Well, thank you for clarifying that. So in this context, then comes Alex Epstein and his book, The Case for Moral Fuels, and you guys working together in the Centre for Industrial Progress. So what is the purpose of your organisation there, Don?
Well, I mean, the best way for me to explain is to give a little bit of how everything came about. So, I mean, my background is mostly just being fascinated with philosophy since I was 13 years old. Actually, before that, I remember going to martial arts, and my favorite part of the class was when the instructor would just throw out little bits of Zen wisdom. But I became interested when I was 14 or 15 in the philosopher Ayn Rand. Obviously, listeners to your show are familiar with her. And when I was in my mid-20s, I got hired by the Ayn Rand Institute, and that's where I met a colleague, Alex Epstein. And I was really fascinated with how he thought and how he spoke and wrote, and just really gained a lot from his mentorship. And in those days, he was interested in every issue under the sun and didn't write about energy at all. But he became interested in energy kind of by accident. And there were sort of two insights that he had that sort of sent him on this path of focusing on energy issues. One was just the importance of energy. That is, energy is the industry that powers every other industry. And so this is a realm where if we make the right choices, everything gets better. And if we make the wrong choices, everything gets worse. And so it's one of the two fundamental industries in an industrial economy. The other fundamental one is finance, which is in effect the funds that fund every other industry. But so that was the first thing that got him interested. And then the second thing that got him interested is, well, if it's so important that we make good decisions, are we going about making those decisions in the right way? That is, are we thinking about them by the principles that are going to lead us to reliable knowledge? So if you think about what philosophy is the science that studies how do we think clearly about things, and in particular, how do we think clearly about how to act? That's the issue of ethics. And when he looked at the energy discussion, it was bad, to put it mildly. So just two sorts of examples, and we can talk about plenty more. It was just incredibly biased. That is, he would only hear negatives about fossil fuels and nuclear energy, and he would hear only positives about solar and wind. And set aside what you think about those different forms of energy. If you're biased, that is not the right way to operate, and you're going to inevitably make bad decisions. Yeah. And the second thing he noticed is that the discussion was incredibly sloppy. And so just one example of that, we obviously hear this, do you believe in climate change, or climate change is real? And that is a very vague question or statement, because it's a very big difference whether you think, yes, the climate is warming, but it's a mild, manageable issue, versus it's runaway, catastrophic, and we need to completely transform our economy in order to address it. Two people could hold diametrically different views. And if you just say, oh, do you believe in climate change? It doesn't distinguish between those fundamentally different views. So Alex became just kind of fueled by this desire to clarify the energy debate first for himself and then for others. And because I was working so closely with him, I would, help edit and just became very interested in the work he was doing in this area. And in 2011, he went and started the Center for Industrial Progress, which the goal was to, more widely than even energy, to provide a new philosophy of industrial progress. Whereas the green philosophy had dominated environmental issues since the 60s, he wanted a pro-human, pro-industrial philosophy that was anti-pollution but pro-development, pro-transforming nature. And then that kind of culminated in 2013, I think, with the publication of his book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, which I helped edit. And so when Alex needed somebody full-time to help him in his endeavors, which is about 2 years ago now, he asked me to join the team, and I've been there ever since.
It's like an example of what Ayn Rand referred to as package dealing. When somebody talks about the issue of climate change, or as it's become from global warming, there's a whole bunch of implications that are sort of wrapped up in that phrase, aren't there? There's a whole. So if you buy into one, the implication is you have to buy into the others. And as you allude to there, that the issue of pollution should rightly be a very, very separate issue indeed from that of carbon dioxide and whatever effect that has, positive and negative, on the climate. So, Don, perhaps before we go any further, can you give us a good working definition for fossil fuels so that everybody knows what we're talking about?
Just in the simplest terms, the real term is hydrocarbon, and it's certain chemicals that have this property that allows them to do really valuable things in really efficient ways. And the number one thing it does is that you have concentrated stored energy that when we through the act of combustion, we can use to power civilization in the most affordable and the most flexible way that we've so far discovered. And so it takes different forms. I mean, the three core fossil fuels, as they're called, would be coal, oil, and natural gas. And these exist in just incredible, plentiful quantities. And what we've been able to do with them is to find more and more of them and develop them economically, and then use them to transform ourselves from, agrarian economies where we live to 30 into technological societies that live until we're 80 and beyond.
Is it true to say that oil is the second most abundant liquid on the planet? Just as a quick tangent, I've heard that said somewhere by somebody.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But it's super abundant. And I mean, there's more oil in the ground than we've used in entire human history. And so one of the concerns that's raised about hydrocarbons historically has been that we face catastrophic depletion. That is, we're going to run out of them, so we need to transition off of them as quickly as possible. And that has been sort of gone out of favor in recent years as the shale technology revolution, including what's called fracking or hydraulic fracturing, has unlocked far more oil than people thought, we were going to be able to access economically.
So the whole idea of peak oil, as it used to be termed, I believe, has that myth been exploded now that we keep hearing about these various oil reserves and, as you say, the new technologies? Would you say that is a myth that's already been exploded?
It's certainly less popular because it's less plausible, but I don't think the basic view that led people to peak oil has not gone away, which is the idea that what human beings do is we take the bountiful resources provided by nature and we just deplete them. And so the idea is always, well, if you're using something, you're just depleting. But we're not depleters, we're creators. That is, oil was not a resource. It was not something that was usable by human beings until we discovered uses for it and discovered how to find it. And what we do is we don't just use it over time. We also discover new ways to find it and economically extract it. And so what we actually end up doing in oil and everything else is creating more resources. That's why historically we've never run out of any so-called natural resource, even though we've been using them for thousands and thousands of years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've heard it said that, for example, aluminium wasn't a resource at all a short while ago, 150 years ago, or whenever, and now, of course, it very much is a resource, and it's human ingenuity and thinking that have made that available. Just before we leave fossil fuels, Don, is there any evidence? Obviously, a fossil they're called fossil fuels, but they don't come from fossils. The idea is more accurately, they come from ancient, decayed biological matter. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually some debate on the source of uh, whether that's universally true. And so that's why the better term is hydrocarbons, but it's definitely
Yeah.
true that essentially what happened is that over time you had dead plants and animals that are basically just compressed by nature over time, and it transforms them into these very stored forms of energy.
You've already touched upon how important it is for our culture, for our civilization, to have cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And this is something, obviously, that the mainstream debate or the average listener to the mainstream debate perhaps doesn't really appreciate, is that how much of the things that we take for granted really, really rely on this cheap and abundant supply of energy. So, I mean, can you elaborate any more around that idea, just to sort of ram home that point for our listeners who may not sort of appreciate, again, that sort of contextual point?
Well, I mean, think about everything that we need in life, right? Whether it's food, clothing, shelter, transportation, like all of it involves moving around natural elements. And by nature, we're very weak, we're very slow. And so what we do is create tools. And the ultimate kind of tools are machines that can do our work for us, that have more strength, more speed, and that then liberate our time. And the issue is, excuse me, the issue is that you need that those machines need to be powered, and what powers them is energy. So everything in our life that's made possible by machine work is made possible by the food of machines, which is energy. And so just a couple sort of like illustrations that are non-obvious, because there's people get, okay, if I'm flying in an airplane, oh, energy is probably pretty important right now. But even take hospitals. 50% of the average hospital's cost is in electricity. That is, all of that stuff needs to be powered. But even go more deeply than that, how is it that we can have people study for years to become doctors? Well, it used to be that over 90% of the population would have to be working in agriculture just to keep ourselves fed. And in that kind of society, you cannot have millions of people who are going to just engage in specialized study of medicine. That's only made possible by an industrial economy that's liberated people from the farms. So even the fact that we have this specialized knowledge of medicine, let alone the actual things that people do in medicine and pharmaceuticals, all of that is made possible by affordable energy. And so there's no part of our life that is untouched by energy, whether it is, transportation, food, medicine, or just the liberation of our time so that we don't have to spend all day working, but we can have a lot of time to study, to socialize, to see the world. All of that is rooted in energy.
Yeah. So there's a huge underappreciation, really, of energy and its importance to the lives that we enjoy. So maybe we can have a look at the sort of summarize the argument against using fossil fuels. And one of the things that I love about the book and your argument there at the Centre for Industrial Progress is that you point out that the pros the negatives of using fossil fuels are huge, and they're this and they're that, and yet the benefits are completely discounted. So you've got the argument is completely skew-whiffed. So would you agree that it's true to say that in summary of the argument against fossil fuels, it's basically that we're going to suffer from imminent climate disaster, with the usual sort of litany of frightening outcomes. And if we use fossil fuels, it's therefore dangerous because we're going to be destroying the planet. Is that in a nutshell, or is there anything that we've left out?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would put it is that so think of it the way that you should think of it, which is we have this need for energy, and we have different possibilities and different alternatives for what we use for energy. And so we have fossil fuels, we have nuclear, we have hydropower. There's so-called renewables, wind, solar. There's this whole range of alternatives, and what we want to be able to do is figure out how do we select the best alternatives. And to do that, we need to look carefully at the positives, the positives and the negatives of the alternatives. And we have to, and when people talk about fossil fuels, there's three main concerns about their negatives. And one we've already talked about, and that's catastrophic depletion. Then you have catastrophic pollution, so that it's going to make our air worse and our water worse, and it has other negative health impacts and impacts on our environment. And then the third is that has catastrophic climate impact, that it's going to make our climate unlivable. And those are basically the three major concerns that you have to think about in order to have a view of whether we should be using fossil fuels or not.
Okay, so, and as you said, we mentioned depletion, and we found that's not really an issue at the moment. Pollution, I think most people would understand that we have the technology to deal with pollution more and more with car catalytic inverters, with the technology that's available to clean up the emissions from power stations. Do you think that pollution is the sort of one of the major considerations, or do you think that's quite achievable to deal with that?
Well, every industrial activity has some sort of negative side effects or potential negative side effects, and using oil, coal, and natural gas is no exception to that. But there's two sorts of issues then. So one issue is that we can also use ingenuity and technology to minimize those impacts. We can use things so that they have less pollution over time. And as you indicated, we have better technology for cars, you have scrubbers for coal plants, and you have a whole bunch of technological things that make these things cleaner. But there is a real issue of your use of these products can have negative impacts on others. And that's why you need the government to establish laws that allow people to use energy, but in ways that don't violate the rights of others. And so, for instance, if you're in a country like the United States or the UK, and we've had a lot of wealth and development, then using the most primitive form of coal and burning that would actually violate the rights of your neighbors, because this is a harm that's not necessary in order to get the energy that we need in order to survive. And so there is a role for government as well to establish when does pollution violate people's rights, and then it has to establish laws that guard against that.
Moving on then to climate, the third component of the risks of fossil fuels, the third component of the argument against them, should we say. And that all, of course, centers around CO2 as produced as one of the key byproducts of the combusting of these hydrocarbons. So we hear an awful lot about the potential negative impacts of CO2. There's a lot of alarmist stuff wrapped around the environmental models, or the computer models, should I say, that aim to predict environmental outcomes, which, as the book Moral Case for Fossil Fuels points out, have quite a poor track record when you look back to about 1980 and some of the predictions made then for 2020. Of course, we see that these catastrophes aren't actually happening. And then you also have factors like global greening, where we can visibly see the theoretical results of increased CO2 in the atmosphere, of course, promoting plant growth. And that can be seen, although I heard something on the BBC News recently that they're trying to discount that now as well. I don't know whether you guys have picked on that. I can't remember the details. So perhaps we can look at this issue of CO2, and as you mentioned previously, with a methodology of rational analysis, look at the disadvantages and the advantages, the pros and cons of CO2. Could you give us something around that?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's take a step back and think, first, what is the goal? The goal is that overall we want human beings to flourish, and one component of that is that we want the most safe climate safety or climate livability as possible. And so we need to look at the impacts of CO2, including the energy that we get from CO2, on climate livability. In what ways does it have positive impacts? In what ways does it have potential negative impacts? And that's, of course, something that's never done.
Okay.
People
And
just
that's all
point
with,
to,
sorry to interject, but that's all specifically in relation to human well-being.
right, absolutely. So what one sort of assumption that's often made, although it's not usually put this explicitly, but there's this assumption that, all right, we're changing the climate, we shouldn't change the climate. That the ideal is we would be able to live our lives and have no impact on climate. But that is completely like that from a human perspective, whether or not we impact the climate is irrelevant. The only question is it beneficial and or not? And so what we want to think about is what is the role of fossil fuels in terms of creating a livable climate or an unlivable climate? And there you named, I think, some of the key things that you want to look at. One is the warming impact and what are the different consequences of that. The second is the consequences for plant growth or global greening. And then the third one is you want to look at the power of energy to aid in adapting to climate. And I think it's important, it's valuable to start with that, because I think this is the overwhelming and most underappreciated aspect of what energy, and particularly fossil fuel energy, allows us to do, which is adapt to climate. So for instance, we were talking about pollution just before, and we talked about potential negatives of pollution coming from fossil fuels, but there's also a potential environmental positive of fossil fuels, which is fossil fuel energy helps us clean up our environment. We would not have clean water if we did not have a lot of energy in order to clean it, in order to direct clean water to places where it didn't exist before. And the same thing is true in the area of climate. Nature doesn't give us a safe climate that we make dangerous. This is a line that Alex likes to say. It gives us a dangerous climate that we have to make safe. And the way we do it is through energy and technology. So one of the key facts that Alex likes to point out, and I found this really compelling the first time I heard it, which is if somebody had asked you, like, how much worse off are we from climate? Like, how much more dangerous has climate become? Well, if there's actually a statistic that can tell you that, which is climate-related deaths. And these have actually decreased by 98% over the last century. And well, why? It's not just because the natural climate has become so much more wonderful. It's because we can protect ourselves and adapt to climate on an unprecedented scale. We can build buildings that are safer than ever. We can have heating and air conditioning, which protect us from two of the biggest killers. I'm in the east coast of the U.S. right now, and we just went through what was called the polar vortex, where parts of the country, particularly in the Midwest, saw temperatures decline to like negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is just really, really cold for those of you who only know Celsius. Millions of people would have died or potentially died if they had not had energy. And in fact, many people, a significant number of people did not have energy, in part because of, in the name of being green, we become more reliant on unreliable solar and wind. We've had the ability to have early warning systems so that when there's massive storms coming through, we can prepare for them rather than just get blindsided by them. So there's all of these ways in which we've used energy and technology in order to protect ourselves from a naturally hostile climate. And if we had more affordable, reliable energy, then we would be even better. And in particular, I'm thinking of like the developed world, where the number one thing that they need is not that we lower temperatures 1 degree over the next century or something like that. The number one thing that they need is the ability to transform nature the way we have. Because if you look at those global declines in the global increase in climate safety, it comes almost solely from the developed parts of the world. And
Right.
so if you really, the people who claim to care about, the world's poor and say, oh, therefore what we need to do is destroy our ability in the developed nations to have affordable energy, it's quite the opposite. What we need to do is export the ideas and policies and technologies that allow those countries to industrialize as well.
Right.
So that is the number one thing you have to keep in mind, is that any policy based on climate that says we're going to restrict our best forms of energy has a very high threshold of evidence to surpass, because the benefits, including the climate benefits, are so enormous. And so then, if you want, we can get into a discussion of the other factors I mentioned about CO2.
We get the fact that energy is really important to protect ourselves from the climate. What about the dangers then of well, I guess so that's kind of, it is tied in with the dangers of not using fossil fuels, because just taking Alex's thing of weighing up things evenly on both sides, we have to look at the dangers of using something and the dangers of not using something. So maybe that's more appropriate to use that framework to discuss nuclear power and the other forms of power such as hydroelectric. But did you want to say something else about fossil fuels, Don, just before we move on to that?
Well, I mean, I would just say on in terms of the negatives, it's important to recognize like that. I mean, we know that CO2 does in a laboratory setting have a warming impact, and I think we definitely have evidence that the world has been getting warmer. But all of the predictions of catastrophe, aside from ignoring our ability for climate mastery, are all based on models that give CO2 an overpowering impact on the climate, and those models have not been borne out they've not been able to reliably predict the actual climate trends we faced. And so I think what we actually have evidence for is that we face this mild ongoing warming trend, and that it's something we can completely adapt to. But let's say that it wasn't, like that we faced a real sort of issue. Then the question would be, how do we reduce CO2 in a way that is most consistent with human flourishing? And if you were really concerned with human flourishing, then the number one thing you would do is say, all right, well, what's our best source of non-CO2 energy? And by far, the best, cheapest, safest form of non-CO2 energy that's scalable, hydro is cheaper than is the cheapest, but it's not very scalable. That is, you can only put it in places where there's the right settings for it. Yeah. Is the best form of non-CO2 energy is nuclear, and yet the very people who say that the world is ending from climate are saying we need to close down nuclear plants. Yes. And that's because they're not genuinely. That it's an illustration of the fact that what they are opposed to is not a climate catastrophe for human beings. What they're opposed to is transforming nature by human beings. And so like nuclear power is us reaching deep into into nature and transforming it on a fundamental level. Yeah. And that's what they oppose.
Sure. And also, I suppose it has to be said, with regards to the CO2 effects of a slightly warmer planet, I think what a lot of people don't realize is the planet has been considerably warmer than it is at the moment. And also CO2 levels have been considerably higher historically than they are at the moment. And, we're all still here, and the planet hasn't, fizzled out and gone pop. So it seems to be that the argument about those negatives of CO2 and all those disaster scenarios that they seem to churn out of the computer models seem to sort of fly in the face of the facts, when we can see that the planet has actually been much warmer previously without any catastrophic result. So as you rightly point out, it seems to be again this sort of anti-human development movement, doesn't it? So it's great. You've introduced these other forms of power, and I believe you refer to them as, or Alex refers to them as the unreliables, as opposed to renewables, because of course whenever you want to boil a kettle or power an incubator to save a baby's life, the wind's stopped or the sun's gone down. So maybe we can explore these other forms of energy. You've touched on nuclear a little bit. Can you just look at those unreliables and maybe examine that case more thoroughly, the pros and cons?
the two most popular forms of energy that we're told we're going to replace fossil fuels, nuclear, and even hydro with are solar and wind. And as you pointed out, like they're intermittent forms of energy. That is, the fuel source is not under our control. It's not at the ready. It comes whenever it wants to, and it doesn't come consistently or even always predictably. And even worse, it often flags at the time when we need it the most. That is, in the evenings and on the coldest and hottest days. And when you have an unreliable fuel, you need to transform it into reliable energy, because we need energy 24/7. And the process used to transform solar and wind into reliable energy, well, there's two. One is if we could store the energy they produce, but that is, it's insanely inefficient, and it would cost basically more money than more wealth than the world produces in a year in order to stock the world with batteries that were enough to support even like the sun and wind not being around for one day, let alone the fact that they can be they can go down and disappear altogether for much longer than that. So storage is out of the question for the foreseeable future. And so the real issue is they need life support. What provides it? Well, what provides it is reliable forms of energy. Fossil fuels, usually natural gas, and then nuclear and hydro. And the problem there is that all of what they're doing is making these other forms of energy run more inefficiently. They're only adding costs. Like you could eliminate solar and wind, and we would be completely fine. If you eliminated their life support they need, then it would be a disaster because we wouldn't have energy. And that's why, despite claims that, solar and wind are more affordable than these other forms of energy, you can't compare directly the cost of solar and wind to the cost of reliable fuel sources. It's like comparing, the cost of a nanny who shows up when she's supposed to with the cost of a nanny who's going to show up and leave whenever she feels like it. You'd say, well, this one's cheaper, but it's not. No, you're dealing with two radically different things. And so that's why we see, when we actually look at places that use solar and wind the most, they have the most expensive energy. So who are the two world leaders in solar and wind? Well, it's Denmark and it's Germany. Who are the two world leaders in terms of expensive energy in the developed world? Denmark and Germany. And it's no accident. It's because when you actually try to impose unreliable power onto a grid, the inefficiencies make it incredibly expensive.
Yeah. And also there's the issue of subsidy as well. I mean, am I right in thinking that the wind and solar forms of energy are really only as affordable as they are at the moment, as a result of huge subsidies? Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I mean, there's a sort of intuitive way to think about it too, which is that, all right, if they really were more affordable, as we've been told, then why do they even need subsidies?
Yeah.
I mean, they're subsidized at many multiples of what fossil fuels are per unit of energy. And, you don't need to subsidize an iPhone to get people to buy iPhones, because people buy them because they think, yeah, this is superior. You don't need to subsidize people to shop at Walmart. Like, they have the actual lowest cost items. The very fact that they require subsidies is an indication that people sense, this would not make economic sense if they didn't exist.
So the free market would punish wind and solar forms of energy. I'm inferring there from what you're saying that's clear to say. But also it's interesting with nuclear, isn't it? Because nuclear is, my understanding is that nuclear is very expensive because of imposed regulation, which is sort of another component going on. It's made artificially more expensive than it would be on a free open market. Is that true?
I mean, it's basically been criminalized by the Green movement. I mean, this was the first attack on energy by the Greens was not fossil fuels; it was nuclear, and they largely succeeded. And so, in most places, it's incredibly expensive, but in places like South Korea, we've actually seen they can build new nuclear economically, and so it's an indication that it's a policy problem, not something inherent to nuclear. But I mean, one way to think about all of these is say, well, Don, you might be wrong about nuclear, you might be wrong about solar and wind. Well, I'm not advocating that any form of energy be imposed on anyone. What I'm for is for energy freedom, which is leave us free to select the best energy and leave energy providers free to compete on a free market on an even playing field. No subsidies, no mandates, and no unfair restrictions, and then you let the best win out. And so if I'm wrong and actually, no, nuclear is not really affordable, even if things are on a free market, or if actually solar and wind are way better than, Don Watkins says, then that's fine. Then, leave people free to choose. And look, I have no inherent bias. I just want the best form of energy possible, whether it's solar, wind, or anything else. What I oppose is the fact of the green movement wants to impose their unproven forms of energy, or in actuality, their failed forms of energy, on the rest of us. And that would be a complete catastrophe.
Absolutely. I've heard it said that they'd like to, to meet all these goals of energy reduction and CO2 reduction and so forth. It amounts to about a 20-fold decrease in the amount of fossil fuels burned. So that's something like 95% reduction in the amount of energy that we all use today, which would be catastrophic. I mean, if we all just personalized that and thought, well, okay, 1/20th of all the car journeys, 1/20th of the nice warm house and the air conditioning and all of the things that we enjoy, if we slashed our energy requirements down, given that fossil fuels is such a huge component of our overall energy usage, that would really hurt, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, even the critics of these people who want to, in the U.S., they're talking about a Green New Deal, which is all of these plans are positioned as idealistic, forward-looking, as ambitious, but all they amount to is using power in order to ban and outlaw our best forms of energy. Like, that is, I don't find that particularly, I mean, it's ambitious in a very negative sense, but it's certainly not inspiring, and it certainly would be catastrophic. I mean, like this idea of, oh, we're going to create a green future, what they're really creating is a green nightmare.
Yeah, very much a sort of a back to the land, return to the primitive, you could say, kind of future. But so when I reflect on my own sort of impressions got from the mainstream narrative in years and decades past, the scare stories about nuclear, for example, when I sort of reach back into my subconscious, I have that initial sort of question mark over nuclear due to all that programming with negatives. And is it safe to assume that all of those negatives about nuclear have been similarly blown out of proportion, shall we say, as we can see that they are more clearly in the fossil fuel side of the debate? I mean, are there any statistics you can show us? I mean, how many people do die of nuclear accidents? And you hear of 3 Mile Island and all this sort of stuff. Can you do anything to dispel that sort of background concern that's sort of residual in most people as a result of the possibly what could be called propaganda that we've heard over the years?
Well, I mean, the main thing is just to know that it's the safest form of energy that's ever existed, and has killed far fewer than any other form of energy that's ever existed. And it's for a reason that's tied to the technology itself. That is, the things that that it can't explode. Like a dam can break and instantly wipe out the surrounding areas. Fossil fuels can explode, and all of those things. That doesn't mean we shouldn't use them, but if we're just looking at the issue of safety, the worst thing that can happen to a nuclear reactor is that you can have a meltdown. But this is something that takes place over a significant amount of time, and people can adapt to. That they can escape and get away. So you have something inherent in the technology that makes it much safer than other alternatives, and like that is Alex is currently revising the moral case for fossil fuels into the moral case for fossil fuels 2.0, and one of the things that he wants to do is have much more of a discussion of nuclear, because it is a very promising technology, and yet we've because of the kind of scare tactics and criminalization, we've not been able to see the real progress, and indeed we've seen regress in
Mhm.
terms of the scale in which it's utilized.
Okay. What about just coming back to fracking? There's heated debate over here in the UK about fracking, and there's a lot of concern that it's contaminating groundwater and various things like that. And all of this, of course, just helps to fuel that the inertia of the public's sentiment against fossil fuels. Can you enlighten us at all about the fracking process, and has that been similarly misrepresented?
Well, I mean, so anytime you drill underwater, you have underground, you have the potential to contaminate groundwater. So this is not a unique risk to fracking. And in fact, fracking is one of the forms of drilling that's least likely to impact groundwater because it takes place a mile or more below the ground, which is far below the waterbed. And there's a lot of technological innovation that goes into protecting the water. And so if you actually look at the track record, I mean, in the US, there's a lot of fracking going on in places like Texas and Colorado, and you're not seeing like people keeling over and whatever. And in fact, if you look at cancer rates in the US, the places where fracking is the most widespread also have the lowest, amounts of cancer, to say nothing of the groundwater issue. So
Sure.
the bottom line is that all of these things have potential risks, but there's no unique fracking risk to groundwater, and there are unique benefits, which is the benefit of incredible amounts of affordable energy. And the people who are promoting fracking bans, they have no concern over health, because if you were really thinking about what does health require, well, it requires a lot of energy, a lot of affordable energy, and then yes, to pursue that in the safest way possible. But if all your contribution to the discussion is I'm going to ban this technology that could make energy way more abundant, then you're not really thinking about and not really concerned with what we need to do to actually achieve health.
Yeah. So it sort of comes full circle, doesn't it, to the correct method of analysis, if you like, and to make sure that we weigh up all the pros and cons equally honestly and equally proportionately, in order to evaluate which is in fact the safest and most appropriate form of fuel to use. And obviously you guys are part of your message in the moral case for fossil fuels is that when we've discussed all of these points, when we've looked conscientiously and logically at the whole issue and all parts of it, that the least damaging form of fuel is fossil fuel, and also combined with nuclear. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would put it is, so the number one thing we're focused on is giving people a better framework. So like, Alex is, I would consider an energy expert. I don't consider myself an energy expert. I know a lot about energy, but my focus is on helping people get frameworks that allow them to make the right decisions about these crucial issues. And once you have the right framework, then you can search out experts who, competing experts, and analyze competing claims, and you can hold them to a high standard. When you don't have the right framework, then you're basically trapped in the position of having to take people on faith and not having the ability to assess, all right, what really is the right choice here. And so I think the number one takeaway from what I've been saying should be not that we should use any particular technology, although I think hopefully I've given some reasons to think that these malign technologies have in fact been malign. The crucial thing is, should we think in a even-handed, precise way about what will promote human flourishing, or should we just keep buying into this idea of, well, let's just be as green as possible, and the scientists say we're facing a climate catastrophe, and solar and wind will somehow solve all our problems? That kind of like way that I think most people have conventionally functioned, like that's a disaster. And unfortunately, absolutely, even the people who like nominally would agree with me that, yeah, fossil fuels are great, I think there too that it's not always having a good it very rarely has a good framework of being looking, very carefully at the alternatives from a pro-human perspective. And so that's the number one problem that I'm interested in solving.
Well, thank you so much for presenting such a good, clear picture of the whole issue, and it does seem to come down to individuals thinking, and as you say, with a proper framework and even the proper philosophical premises and assumptions right at the bottom of it. I love this idea that it's all about promoting human flourishment, and if we bear in mind that is the primary purpose, why are we burning energy at all? It's to further human lives. That's one that is so easy to just forget about, isn't it? The mainstream debate just doesn't touch that one. So it's a very enlightening message, and thank you so much for delivering it today, Don. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.
So for people interested, then obviously I'll leave links to the Centre for Industrial Progress, where you and Alex work, and others, obviously. Are there any other main resources apart from Alex's book that you would like to share, or go-to places that you'd like to share for any listeners?
Yeah, but the number one thing, if people are intrigued by these ideas, is to go to industrialprogress.com, and there you can sign up for our newsletter. And that's where we share everything that we're doing and a ton of free resources. And so that they can just go to industrialprogress.com and sign up for that. And then the other thing to check out is that Alex, me, and our head of research, Stefan Henne, have a podcast called Power Hour, where each week we spend an hour delving into the most important issues in energy from a human flourishing perspective.
Wonderful. Well, look, thank you so much for that, Don. That's great. I'll have all the details of those below and in the show notes for the podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and I totally recommend that you visit the website lawfulrebel.com for more topics such as these that can help us think outside the box and ultimately to thrive. And I do hope you'll join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Be the change you want to see. Be the change you want to see.